Hello, and welcome to another video installment of Melendy Avenue Review. If you watched my last video, and I recommend you do, I thought it was, pretty good, you might have noticed that many of the books that I talked about as being the worst books I read in 2020 had a certain political slant. The last four, the bottom four on sort of the bottom 10 list in particular, were all works by writers who I think is fair to describe as being right-wing. As it happens, I like reading both fiction and nonfiction by a lot of different kinds of writers. And I don't think there's any political litmus test for quality in either fiction or nonfiction. There might be a political litmus test in terms of the political applicability of ideas, but I don't think that's the same as quality writing, quality thought. There's a fair amount of talk of separating art from the artist or not separating art from the artist. As it happens, I don't believe in separating art from artist. And I think the prevalence of that phrase in kind of popular critical thought in the last few decades is a sad sign of the ways in which so many works of art across mediums and genres has been created by kind of faceless corporate assembly lines, essentially. But even those works, if you look at them, they're designed by somebody or groups of people. And usually, if you try to understand who those artists were, what they believed, what they thought they were doing, you can appreciate a work at a deeper level. And that goes from your mass-produced cultural products all the way on to the great works of high art. So no, I don't separate art from artist. But I don't have a political or moral litmus test for what I read, watch, or enjoy. I don't think that's a particularly worthwhile way of engaging with culture. If that's what you do, it's what you do. If it's what you have to do, it's what you have to do for your potentially emotional health, all right? But what I try and do when I run into great art that has ideas or themes or whatever that I disagree with, that offend me, that really make me wonder what the other person possibly could have been thinking, I try not to reject it. I try to sit with it. I try and sit with the contradictions, sit with it, think about it, talk to other people about it. In this instance, I suppose make videos about it. And you do you, but I think that the more people learn to sit with things, and we've got enough urgent problems that not everything needs to be treated as a problem in urgent need of fixing. So if they could take things that aren't that and sit with them and think about them and ruminate on them and interact with other people about them, I think, both we would have sort of a better quality of thought out there, and would probably, I found it's improved my life, whatever that's worth. All right, stepping down off the soapbox, I've read what I feel are a lot of good and thoughtful right-wing writers. Here, I'm going to use Corey Robin's definition of the political right as meaning attachment to hierarchy, a belief in hierarchy as a superior form of human organization, and to a certain extent, a belief in hierarchy for hierarchy's sake. I go a little bit off Corey Robin's script in that I do think there is a certain attachment to, if not the past, as in literal actual history, which precious few people all across the political spectrum seem to care about, but an idea of the past, I do tend to think of as a right-wing or conservative trait. Obviously not exclusively. You do get a lot of left-leaning or centrist or apolitical people with attachments to the past. I do tend to thinking that the past is better than the present, unless you've got a really good reason. Usually, I would call that, at least most of the time, a right-wing idea. So what that means is I have a wide range of politics represented among the writers I'm going to talk about today. You have people who, by any definition of the word, would count as fascists, and I do believe that fascism is a right-wing movement, not neither right nor left. To borrow from a historian I actually have a lot of respect for, Zeev Sternhell, and certainly not a left-wing movement, as various stupid people say. But it runs from fascists, this list, all the way out to fairly apolitical but conservative-leaning people. I'm not going to get into the whys and wherefores of who is what type of conservative or right-winger for time purposes, and it just doesn't interest me that much. You can go nuts in the comments, I suppose, if I get many commenters. Some other notes about the list. This is not an ordered list, right? Last time I had the bottom 10 books, and as we went on, they got worse and worse. In this instance, I just ordered them, not quite randomly, but, you know, according to what I thought made sense to me at the time when I was writing this. The writers are here for my perception of their quality, their greatness, if you will, not for their influence. So I don't include such influential right-wing writers as Edmund Burke, Rudyard Kipling. I don't include whatever American conservative writers are meant to be big deals these days, whether in the popular or the critical press, because I don't consider them good enough, frankly. I have not read all of any of the writers that I am discussing. So, you know, I might be missing out on some stuff. I've read most of some of them. And finally, you know, I'm not here to attack or defend anyone's politics or anyone's morality. I'm here to talk about writing. You can feel free to inform me whatever you think about any of these writers or other writers in the comments. Lastly, there are some writers I'm going to bracket out of my list. And I'm doing that because people already know about them, people already like them, they're kind of in the party of literature already, they're accepted by most people as great writers, great thinkers. And sometimes there's some other reasons, like I don't know, you'll see. So there's 4 that I'm bracketing. The first is Fyodor Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky belongs to a kind of peculiar clade of writers who I respect, but don't really enjoy. There's a lot of writers like that, a lot of big-name literary writers. Maybe I'll do a video on that one of these days. Either way, I'm not going to have Dostoevsky on the list. Everybody already knows he's great. Everybody already knows he's important. He was definitely, I think, for my money, at the very least, conservative Russophile even arguably when he was in the movement, whatever that meant in Russia in his day. The second is Friedrich Nietzsche. Also possibly somewhat controversial to put him on the right, but I put him on the right in a pretty unproblematic way as far as I'm concerned. I know he has a lot of fans elsewhere on the political spectrum, and that's fine. Personally, I find him to be a better historiographer than a philosopher, but, you know, history makes all more sense to me than philosophy in most cases anyway. The third writer I am not going to discuss or put on the list is J.R.R. Tolkien. Not, super right-wing. He despised fascism, despised anti-Semitism, but he does seem like a ye olden times were better conservative Catholic type. I don't need to go on and on about his achievements, his accomplishments, the grandeur of his work. I love Tolkien, but he doesn't need to be on the list because everybody already likes him. Lastly, we have one of my favorite writers, Jorge Luis Borges. Mostly apolitical, actually, but particularly in the kind of overheated political context of Latin American letters in the 20th century, his despising of figures like Juan Perón, and his real dislike for disorder and whatnot, I think makes him a conservative as far as, this list would be concerned. But, again, he's widely loved, widely respected, doesn't need to be on this list. So with that, we'll proceed to the 10 writers that I do have on this list. And the first up is Louis-Ferdinand Céline. Céline was arguably the greatest prose innovator of the 20th century. He was highly influential. I know this isn't meant to be an influence list, but he was. But relatively few of the people he influenced, with some honorable exceptions like Kurt Vonnegut, are willing to admit it. And that's because he was a bad dude, along with being a right-winger. He was scabrously anti-Semitic. Collaborator doesn't really get it across his behavior in France during World War II. He didn't particularly like the Nazis. He didn't particularly like anybody, but he thought that Germany and France needed to band together to destroy the Jews and save European civilization, supposedly. But that's not really what we're here for. We're here for quality writing. And what you got with Céline was something like kind of Joyce-style stream of consciousness. But I believe that Céline was the superior writer and innovator to Joyce because, among other things, his stream of consciousness resembles something like consciousness as I understand it, which, frankly, I like some James Joyce, but James Joyce, particularly Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, never resembled consciousness as I understood it. And also, and I think this is a good thing for a writer to be, apparently many literary people disagree with me, but Céline, unlike Joyce most of the time, was funny. He was funny. He tells tales of low life in Paris from when he was a kid. He writes about World War I. He wrote 3 books about fleeing for his life from Paris after the liberation, World War II, and he complains the whole time about how the liberationist mobs stole his coffee table and his motor scooter, and it's really funny. So in terms of a recommended text, I'm going to try and recommend a text from each of the authors I talk about. Journey to the End of the Night's great. Castle to Castle, which is the first part of that trilogy I mentioned, is great. But for a first look at Céline, I would go with Death on the Installment Plan, which is sort of Céline's answer to Proust, going on about his childhood. Céline goes on about his childhood in Paris as sort of a lower middle class kid, and it's really great. So moving on to our second writer, I've selected Yukio Mishima. So Mishima is pretty much the opposite for me in nearly every way. Mishima was Asian, Japanese. He was gay. He was a reactionary nationalist, and he was jacked, if you look up pictures of him. Whereas I am white, I am straight, I am a socialist, and I am fat. Moreover, Mishima seemed to think and write solely in terms of aesthetics and gestures, rather than in the kind of analytical/political/moral register that I usually use. I've heard fascism called the aestheticization of politics, and whatever else you want to say about that definition, it certainly fits with Mishima. Mishima disemboweled himself at a Japanese army base after trying to get the soldiers there to join him in a coup to restore Japan's imperial military rule like it had in World War II. And this was in the 70s when he did this. Unlike today's fascists, Mishima actually did have a pretty strong sense of aesthetics. He knew what he was doing. He wrote sensitively and beautifully, penetrating character studies, language that shines through even through the translation. He's well worth reading. Recommended text: The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. It's about a pre-adolescent boy who's part of a gang of kids. Those kids are dedicated to amorality and achieving ultimate experience. They worship and then feel betrayed by a sailor, and gruesomeness ensues. Next up, we have V.S. Naipaul, Nobel Prize winner as well. I think he might be the only one on this list, but I'm not sure. Everybody supposedly loves satire. We got satire all over the place, supposedly. But seemingly no one can define it or tell when someone is doing a good job, except insofar as good job means agrees with me. Well, I don't think I agreed with Naipaul on much, but he was certainly a great satirist. This, despite his punching down, or anyway punching laterally. His best books addressed colonialism and its legacies from the point of view of outsiders to the kind of colonizer-colonized dyad that became so important in the mid-20th century. So he was descended from imported Indian laborers to Trinidad. So there you had this kind of three-way society with the European colonizers on top, and then a mass of descendants of African slaves, and then kind of in the middle were these Indo-Trinidadian laborers. You see that in a lot of colonial situations. And anyway, he applied his biting wit and talent for writing in assorted voices to everyone involved. Colonizer, colonized, people in the middle like his own people. He didn't spare people when perhaps he might have if he were nicer, right? He had no sympathy for the oppressed. He had no problem punching down. He was patronized in both the literary career and emotional sense of the word by the British Tory literati. Ultimately, he was more interested in who he hated than who he liked, and that's a trait that he shares with many of the writers I'm going to talk about today. So my recommended text is A House for Mr. Biswas, which is about 600 pages of positional warfare between an Indo-Trinidadian young fogey and everyone and everything else. And it's funny. For 600 pages, it moves right along. In some cases, it's even pretty moving. So next up, I'd like to talk about Gene Wolfe. There's a good amount of right-leaning sci-fi fantasy writers, and there always have been. Some of them, like Robert Heinlein, were hot garbage as writers. But the right side of sci-fi arguably has the greatest artist in the genre's history on their side, and that man is Gene Wolfe. Wolfe's science fantasy tetralogy, The Book of the New Sun, has it all. Epic journeys, intimations of deep history, love, war, aliens, time travel, all of it in beautiful, epigrammatic prose. I don't think I've ever marked up a work of fiction the way I have my copies of the New Sun books, because they're just wonderful turns of phrase and fascinating thoughts throughout the text. A through line in the series is mankind's incapability of achieving grace on his own, and the necessity of ineffable outside intervention to grant man that grace. And that's a theme presumably drawn from Wolfe's very fervent Catholicism. Fun fact, Gene Wolfe was a food engineer before becoming a full-time writer, and he helped invent the Pringle. Recommended text. What I've got here is the first two books in one volume of the Book of the New Sun. You can, if I get it real close up. No, I was going to try and show you how many pages I dog-eared, but it doesn't really work. The first book in the series is The Shadow of the Torturer. It's the beginning of a long journey where the main character, Severian, who is raised by a guild of torturers and executioners in the far future of the earth, goes into exile after showing mercy to a prisoner. It only gets better and weirder from there. Next writer I want to talk about is Ernst Younger. Most of the canonical German writers handed down to us from the 20th century, either avoided getting into Nazism altogether or else flirted with and recanted. So think about figures like Hermann Hesse, Thomas Mann, Günter Grass, Erich Maria Remarque. That's kind of the canonical German 20th century in many respects. I'm sure there's others then you can yell at me about. Then you have Ernst Younger, who was the great German World War I memoirist. He was also a political writer and a novelist. Jünger wasn't a Nazi. He preferred kind of the higher intellectual tone of the group known as the conservative revolutionaries. But the Nazis liked him. They liked him enough to make him the literary censor of occupied Paris. Jünger survived and even thrived in post-war Germany. He wrote some very weird and interesting stuff that could only be called speculative fiction. And to the best of my knowledge, he never once recanted his calls to overthrow the Weimar Republic or his collaboration with Nazism. He just kept on living. Recommended text. I'm tempted to say the book Oimsville, one of his later works, which is a very weird book and very interesting to me. But it has to be, my recommendation has to be Storm of Steel, which, for my money, is the great World War I book. And World War I produced a lot of quality literature. And it was written by a guy, Ernst Younger, who genuinely seemed to love the trenches. And that's, that's a perspective you don't get a lot of in the writing they assign in colleges and high schools. Next writer, Frank Herbert. Unlike the authors I discuss in this list of 10, I've only read one book by Frank Herbert, but it's a doozy. I'm talking, of course, about Dune. My understanding is that Herbert's later works are more explicitly kind of eco-fascist, but I can't know without having read them. In Dune, you do have space feudalism, jihads, and a lot of biological determinism. I suppose if I thought Herbert needed defending, I'd say, well, he doesn't specifically say all that stuff is good, which is a refrain I've heard elsewhere from people who feel the need to defend their tastes on political or moral grounds. Well, A, I don't feel like I need to defend him. That's not the point of this video. And B, I think that's nonsense. Good is irrelevant in this case. I think Frank Herbert very clearly thinks all that space monarchy, biological determinism stuff is cool. Consider what an adolescent boy, the target audience for most far-right politics, incidentally along with much of the entertainment industry, thinks is more important, being good or being cool. Either way, Dune is awesome and well worth the investment if you haven't read it, and it is obviously my recommended text for this author. Next up, Evelyn Wall. George Orwell said something about how in the 30s, all the British intellectuals were either becoming communists or Catholics, which, along with a lot of Orwell's insights, was also a sneaky way of praising himself, George Orwell, for doing neither. I'll leave that aside. Evelyn Wah is an example of one of the people who took the latter route. And we're not talking about nice Pope Francis type Catholicism here. We're talking about the reactionary early 20th century kind. Evelyn Wall was a good get for the right side of the 30s ideological war raging across the world. He was a sharp-tongued satirist, equally at home at savaging the society he lived in, punching up and punching down and punching laterally without caring what bloggers might think, and getting all elegiac and weepy about what we supposedly lost due to modernity. My recommended text for Waugh, his magnum opus is supposedly Brideshead Revisited, and it's a good book. It's worth reading. It is pretty heavy and quite lugubrious, a lot of, modernity. And so my recommendation would be his first novel, Decline and Fall, also critical of contemporary liberalizing British society, but it's shorter and funnier. Next up, Jack Vance. In 1968, one of the big sci-fi magazines ran an unusual spread. On one page, you had a short statement against the Vietnam War. On the opposite page, you had a short statement supporting the war, and each one of these statements was signed by dozens of prominent figures from the sci-fi world. Jack Vance's name was there in support of the ongoing atrocity that was the Vietnam War. Beyond that, his stories are illustrations of the limitations of human beings' capacity to change their circumstances. and that's intertwined with the notion that humanity itself is infinitely plastic, moldable into all kinds of twisted shapes by environmental and social pressure. And those stories are a hell of a lot of fun. Vance invented dozens of worlds, not crafting them exquisitely like a Tolkien or a Herbert, but dashing them off on the rapid schedule of a pulp writer. And they all work. The ones I've read, anyway. His writing revels in the sheer joy of words, often deployed by his characters with cruelty without ever coming off as pretentious. He was also one of the major influences on Dungeons & Dragons and on the show Adventure Time in the bargain. My recommended text here is The Tales of the Dying Earth, with a caveat. You can skip the earlier stories. They're good, but they're not great. And you can go straight to The Eyes of the Overworld, which is where Vance really gets into his groove. And my copy, which is from Orb, they don't have a table of contents? It's Bush League. Oh, no, they do. Sorry, take it back, Orb. 131, page 131, you get The Eyes of the Overworld. So read that one first if you're new to Jack Vance. Next up, Windham Lewis. He was a leading British painter, along with being a novelist and an essayist. Windham Lewis is arguably Exhibit A in the cultural history argument of why traditionalism is a stupid look for the far right. Even, I'm not here to help the far right do its business, but some things need to be said. Artistic modernism always has substantial right-wing elements, from the Franco supporter Salvador Dali, to the Italian futurists, to T.S. Eliot, to Windham Lewis. Unlike most high modernists, though, Windham Lewis actually had a sense of humor. In many respects, Lewis is a representative figure of the intellectual life in that wild era, encompassing the world wars and the period between them, when there was something like a genuine challenge to conventional Christian-based morality in the West. For my money, it was a much more open and thoroughgoing rebellion than anything you saw in the 1960s or anything you see today. Maybe I'll do another video about that, I don't know. Windham Lewis didn't care about morals. He cared about aesthetics and he cared about pain, preferably other people's pain, but he'd write about his or paint about his too. This attitude produced some great art and was by no means restricted to Windham Lewis or the political right. This attitude also helped exacerbate the great disasters of that era, so, anyway, recommended text. Tarr, which is a story of how stupid and ridiculous artists like Lewis were and are, both literarily innovative and readable and enjoyable. Finally, for this list of 10, we have Charles Portis. Portis is probably my favorite comic writer. Arguably, P.G. Wodehouse of Jeeves and Wooster fame was greater, as in more influential, than Portis, but Portis is still my favorite. Portis's 5 novels constitute arguably the most perfect body of work I can think of anywhere in literature. He wasn't exactly a screaming wingnut, but his work does display a skepticism towards the claims of busybodies of all kinds, including some fairly cutting portrayals of progressives. Like any good comic writer, he knew how to pick his shots. So Guy Dupree, the villain of The Dog of the South, would seem just sort of wrong and ludicrous in any other setting than late 1970s radical circles. And in that setting, he's perfect. Portis was also had something of a Confederate nostalgic streak in him, and word around the water coolers that it came out more in private than in his published work. Though his writings have characters of color who are pretty sensible and sympathetic. In any event, I can thoroughly recommend any of Charles Portis's novels to anyone who likes quality English writing. It's pretty hard to recommend a single text. All 5 of his novels are fantastic. Masters of Atlantis has a special place in my heart, but it has to be The Dog of the South, which is a quest into the heart of Central America, the heart of pedantry, and the heart of the peculiar miseries of the 1970s. But what about nonfiction? I can hear you saying, well, I've got you covered there too. There's some great right-leaning nonfiction writers, and so I'm going to recommend some of those a little more quickly than I was with literary writers. So we have Carl Schmitt, political theorist, Nazi jurist. He joined the Nazi Party the same day in 1933, so he was a late joiner, as his pal Martin Heidegger. He was a theorist of the friend-enemy concept as the basis of politics, and I think anyone who takes politics seriously, they don't need to agree with this thesis, but they need to at least think about it. So my recommended text for him is The Concept of the Political. I have a little sneaky PDF printout there. There's also Forrest McDonald. He was a historian of the early United States. He was also a co-founder of the League of the South. Some of you might remember from the mayhem at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2018. McDonald quit before it became an alt-right fighting group, to his credit. He has a lot of important insights into the intellectual world of the Founding Fathers, and it doesn't bother me that a kind of, a paleoconservative was making these points, because frankly, I don't worship at the Church of the Founding Fathers in any event. My recommended text for him is Novus Ordo Seclorum, which is about the intellectual origins of the United States Constitution. Another historian to recommend, Ernst Kantorowicz. He was a great medievalist. He was also a member of the Freikorps as a young man after World War I. He was kind of in the same conservative revolutionary camp as Jünger, if I understand the history properly. He had to flee Germany because Freikorps, no, he was still a Jew. And he reconceptualized many of our ideas about monarchy, primarily in this recommended text, The King's Two Bodies. Very fascinating book. Next up, we have Joseph de Maistre, who was a philosopher of counter-revolution, roughly the same time as Burke. He rhapsodized about violence and punishment, has a whole thing about how the hangman is the symbol of civilization, etc., etc. Much more interesting than Burke, in my opinion, who had some good turns of phrase, but was something of a sentimentalist, which would be quite important in conservatism moving on, but it's doesn't interest me as much. My recommended text, Considerations on France, which kind of gets across some of the basics of his thought. Also from the 19th century, we have Karl von Clausewitz. He was a great writer on strategy. He was more of a philosopher of war, borrowing from the likes of Hegel than like a practical how-to guide, as I imagine many, businessmen have probably found out reading him after giving Sun Tzu a try. He was a, supporter of the Prussian monarchy. He wasn't, particularly out there conservative thinker, but a conservative nevertheless. Recommended text, of course, would be his magnum opus on war, Vom Krieg. Well worth reading. A little bit of a brick of a book, but well worth reading. Next up, we have Henry Adams, who I've written about in a few places. He was a scion of the Adams political clan of Massachusetts, grandson of John Quincy Adams. He was a historian, a journalist, an art connoisseur. He did a lot in his life. He was a major critic of early 20th century, late 19th century modernity, and he was also a ravening anti-Semite. My recommended text, The Education of Henry Adams. Very interesting book. Lastly, we have H.L. Mencken, who was the editor of the American Mercury, which was an important American literary magazine in the early 20th century. It launched the careers of a number of major writers of numerous different persuasions. Mencken was arguably the original kind of right-leaning cut-up, at least in American culture. Kind of the predecessor of various figures we see today. But a much better writer and thinker than most of them, who's dedicated to ridiculing the pretenses of those who would think that life could be made nicer or more equitable. Some of them deserved it, some of them didn't. Either way, there's no sort of one major text that I would recommend of his. He was really, I think, a better essayist and a long-form writer, though a lot of people think the American language, his linguistic text, is pretty good. I haven't read it. I would recommend this collection, A Mencken Chrestomathy. Chrestomathy is a fancy word for sort of the best of. Apparently, he selected these as his own, according to the subtitle. All right, there's some nonfiction books for you. But wait, I can hear you saying, all these people have something in common. They're all dead. Portis, Wolfe, Vance, and McDonald and Naipaul died relatively recently, but they're all dead. They're all gone. Aren't there any living right-wing writers you would recommend? As it happens, not all that many, but, you know, I do want to make the audience happy, so I can recommend 3. One is John Whitbourne. He is an English fantasy writer. He writes these very interesting stories of a counter-Reformation magical England. So a world where Protestantism failed, and there's magic, and it's weird and interesting. He's also a correspondent of mine, and I did an interview with him for the San Antonio Review, a quite long, lengthy interview. He had a lot to say. He was in a, I'm trying to remember the word he used, a valedictorian, perhaps, mood. But either way, he waxed. If he sees this, hello, John. Hope you're doing well and hope the family's doing well. Recommended text. His first novel, A Dangerous Energy, which introduces you to the world of his wacky counter-Reformation England. Second living writer I would recommend would be Michel Houellebecq. Probably not pronouncing that last name right. My French is very bad. He is a major French novelist, arguably the major French novelist working. I find his work to be highly uneven. I haven't read his latest. I will read it at some point. We'll see. His earlier works especially, I think, are very well written, and they present interesting and scathing critiques of modern society. And of those, my favorite is The Elementary Particles. I believe in England it's translated as Atomized. A difficult work in certain respects. You know, he doesn't pull his punches, but it's short and well worth reading. Finally, for good contemporary right-leaning American writers, we have James Ellroy, the great contemporary American crime writer as far as I'm concerned. James Ellroy has had a long career of both trolling contemporary sensitivities about race and sex, and of putting out considerably more literary innovation and critical insight into how American life works and worked. Some of his work is historical, than other nicer writers that I might agree with more on politics. My recommended text for him would be American Tabloid, which is the beginning of his Underworld USA trilogy, which for my money is his best work, some of the best American crime fiction out there, well worth reading. I wrote about it in Jacobin a number of years ago, and actually, as it turns out, he liked the article so much that he called up my editor, and he got my address, and he apparently had me couriered a nice bottle of booze from a local liquor store, which was super nice of him. The catch was, I was in a conference in Toronto at the time, and somebody, a porch pirate, so to speak, lifted it, and presumably drank the goods and threw away whatever note might have been there. I really would have liked that note. What can you do? All right, that's about... Oh, no, I hear it. I hear you. What about women? What about women right-wing writers? Well, I've read Ein Rand. Ein Rand is garbage. Garbage as a person, garbage as a thinker, most pertinently, garbage as a writer. I'm sorry, it's just the case. One of the nicer things about our the turn to fascism on the part of the contemporary right is that you hear less about Ein Rand. I don't really know who else there is. I've been meaning to read for some time Zora Neale Hurston, one of the great Black American women writers that people recommend a lot. I have a copy of Their Eyes Are Watching God. I don't know if she counts as a conservative. I do know she was opposed to integration in the Brown v. Board of Education decision. That doesn't necessarily make you a conservative, but I understand she was also had some other right-wing leanings. I don't really know. I don't know her biography that well. I understand she was sort of like, I don't know if they ever met, but was within friends of friends with Ein Rand. Would have been getting those Facebook friend recommends had Facebook been around and they used it at the time. But I don't know. I don't have any for you. I have, a few people of color on there, but no women. Sorry, gals. In closing, one thing I will say, having written this, having racked my brain, I mean, not really racked, a number of them came to mind organically, having really thought about it, very few of these people really fit in with any of the major right-wing projects that had power at their time. Okay? Céline was a fascist, didn't get along with other fascists. And you get the same thing down the line. Windham Lewis complimented Hitler, later recanted, didn't really go in with various other conservatives. I think you'd have a really hard time fitting any of these writers into the major right-of-center parties that exist in the major countries of today or in the countries of their origins. Even the ones who are still alive. Michel Houellebecq voted for Macron against Marine Le Pen. I don't really, it's funny, I know John Whitborn, know him better than the others. I don't really know his voting record and don't care to know. Elroy, I know, praised Obama pretty extensively, has not commented on Trump. Doesn't have to, whatever. What I think is that the right is no longer the place for that kind of heterodoxy. I mentioned this in my last video, but that starting in the US, and arguably also in Britain with the rise of neoliberalism, neoliberalism came in many respects on a tide of sentimental bullshit. That's what Reagan sold. To a certain degree, that's what Thatcher sold. In a much more brutal way, that's what the Latin American autocracies a la Pinochet sold. And the Latin American right still sells. And the right globally sells. The kitschy caricatures of nationhood. They were never, nationalism generally is a little bit kitschy from my, ivory tower, I guess. But there is an element of deadness to it, right? Sentimentality is dead feeling, propped up and made to parade around like a living feeling. And that is what the American right from Reagan to Trump represents. That is what, I'm sorry, but the alt-right or the supposed edgy right-wingers, same thing. Scratch their nihilism and you get sentimentality. That's what you see in the Putin regime. That's what you see in the Modi regime. That's what you see in the Bolsonaro regime. You see it all over the world. And sentimentality has never produced great writing. It produces bad thinking. It produces bad art. And, on that encouraging note, I'm going to list in the show description or the caption, whatever you call it, my recommended texts. You can pick them up, preferably from a local bookstore, if you can. I will link to the articles I mentioned, my piece on Elroy, my interview with Whitbourne. I will also link to the Melendy Avenue Review Substack, which is where you can get all my critical writings, links to friends' critical writings or other cultural productions, pictures of my cat. She's really pretty. And that's that. Until I see you next time. Have a good one.